A vulnerability is just not a risk. It doesn't start becoming a risk until it's associated with some plausible loss associated with your value at risk. Again, what the business stands to lose. Just want to be clear. One of the reasons that security operations has such a difficult time is because they're looking at tactical things that are disconnected from value. And then going to people, going to engineers, going to your CTO, whatever, and say, hey, you can thank me later. Here's 100,000 vulnerabilities. Go fix them. But listen, their job is to go generate value for the business, to release products, make sure the platform is resilient. And you're coming with what, without any context, without tied to the business, is just a distraction. It's no wonder why we don't see the sorts of actions that we would expect.
This is KBCast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is security and testing and performance and scalability.
risk and compliance,
We can actually automate those.
take that data and use it.
Joining me today is Richard Seiersen, Chief Risk Technology Officer from Qualys, and today we're discussing how to measure and communicate what matters in cybersecurity risks. So, Richard, thanks for joining and welcome.
My pleasure. I'm just glad to be here and really enjoying my time down under.
So let's start right there. So, what do you mean by what does matter in cybersecurity risk? Because I think the reason why I asked that question is, when as I mentioned to you before we started, done close to 300 interviews, and every person that I interview, what they sort of say matters. So, what's sort of standing out for you when I ask you that question?
I think a lot of people, well intentioned, will have an objective of trying to secure all the things. So, what I mean by that is, for example, if you were to talk to your board or your E team or your risk committee, again, I'm thinking about a security leader here, they would say things like, we don't want to be hacked. We have zero risk tolerance. We want you to be ready and defend us against all possible nation state and other pedestrian sorts of attacks. And while that's well intentioned, that's not practical. And so, what I'm recommending, what Qualys is recommending, and I think other people who I suppose or have similar backgrounds to myself, what we're saying is let's focus on those risks that would prevent the business from achieving their objective. What are those things that would get in the way of a business fulfilling its obligation to its stakeholders, to its shareholders, to its customers? So that's what we mean.
Yeah, you raise a great point on, people want to say I don't have any risks, but I think with anything in life or businesses, there's always going to be some element of risk. So what do you sort of respond when someone says, "Oh, well, Richard, I don't want any risk." How do you how do you approach that?
Well, you may not want any risk, but if you're in business, you are taking a risk, right? A successful business, let's talk about what that is. Successful business is exposing more value to more people through more channels at higher velocity. I'll say that again. A successful business is in the business of exposing more value to more people through more channels at higher velocities with the hopes of more revenue and more profits. That you could perhaps call that exposure digital transformation, or actually the cool kids today would call that digital and AI transformation. So you're taking a risk, you're exposing value with the hopes that you're going to transact, right? But when you expose, you're also exposing yourselves to the bad guy. So by your very nature of a successful business, you're really a risk-creating machine. So the question then becomes, how can we, in a capitally efficient, an operationally efficient manner, protect that exposure so that you can do transactions, so you can make money and not lose your shorts to the bad guy?
Okay, you raised a couple of things there in terms of, the capital side of it. So I was in a discussion on the weekend, actually, a couple of friends of mine post what's happened recently in the news. And apparently, I know I didn't see the interview. Apparently, someone in Australia got on like, the news or something, was giving this interview around, yeah, okay, we have to have contingencies, which absolutely makes sense, like, option A or maybe option B. But apparently this person was going like option C, D, and E. And then, my friends who are in this space were like, that's just not practical. Or else companies would literally go broke if we thought about option A all the way to E thought through. So do you think sometimes when people are thinking about risk, like, do you think that they over engineer it? Do you think they undercook things? What are your sort of thoughts on that?
So just by the way, a little extra background on myself. I've, been a serial recovering CISO now for a number of years, but also along the way, I've been doing quite a bit of consulting. So I've worked with, gosh, for maybe 500, 600 CISOs, largely across the Fortune 1000, focusing on risk quantification, strategy, board presentation. And what I see, honestly, by and large, in terms of approaches, while they are intending and wanting to focus on business risk, they're typically focusing on securing all the things, right? So there's not really a thought given to, again, where is the business really transacting value? For example, where could there be business disruption? You think about what happened with CrowdStrike, right? In fact, I was trying to fly over here from the US and I couldn't get my ticket. I got here last minute, I was able to get my ticket, but the airline, which will not be named, was disrupted. And I could, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make it to Australia. So business disruption, where could you experience outsized business disruption? What about breach? Are you persisting and transacting on a lot of regulated data? Perhaps wire fraud, right? What about extortion relative to revenue, right? So again, let's focus on, and even by the way, espionage, depending on the nature of your business. Where do you have what I'd call risk classes or large, loss classes? Where do those exist? And then let's think about where there are plausible threats to them. So it's not everything. We want to focus on those things that really matter most. Otherwise, you're left to what you just said. Where if someone's, they're going contingency A, B, C, D through Z, et cetera, or Z, as you might say, they're really, again, thinking about securing all the things, and they're not prioritizing based on the business. And that's where my advocacy comes in. Let's focus on what the business stands to lose. Let's think about what the plausible threats are, and then let's go ahead and build towards, again, mitigating those risks and or transferring them away where possible.
Couple of interesting things there, and you're right. So it's like, from a cybersecurity perspective, in a perfect world, we want zero risk, all this type of thing. But like you said, we're in business. That's the game, right? So, do you think sometime? I mean, I'm a cybersecurity person by trade, and so are you. So it's like, well, do you think we've sort of created our own rod for our back, right? Because this person giving this interview was a cybersecurity person, but that what this person was saying just isn't practical. Companies would go bankrupt. So it's like we cannot think all the way to A to Z, right? In terms of contingencies and plans and what are we going to do if this fails and then that happens. I get it. You need to have some, contingency, but not to the level where it's like, oh my gosh, we've just blown our entire budget on this because there needs to be thought through. So
Right.
sometimes it sort of just alludes to me that, we've created a little bit of this problem then as well.
Yes. So the point where I think you're going with this is, how do we maximize really our return on control? That's kind of how we think about it. And the way you know if whether you're spending enough, whether you're being capitally and operationally efficient, it's again going back to relative to what you stand to lose, right? Both the likelihood and impact. So I want to invest in such a way where I can buy down risk. And again, there'll always be some amount of residual risk. And in that case, for that residual risk, then I have to think about, okay, how can I maybe transfer that away? Again, buying controls, investing in security technology, you're a practitioner, right? People, process technology, et cetera. It is very expensive, right? And again, if you overinvest there, you're going to take money away, again, from that value generation, exposing more value to more people, et cetera. And so the job of the CISO is to look at how they can be capitally efficient relative to what the business stands to lose. And again, it includes really two main moves: buying down risk through investments in people, process technology, and additionally, transferring risk away through insurance.
Okay, so Richard, now I've got a question around whilst you were talking, what was coming to my mind is in my previous life, you'll appreciate this. I used to collect pen testing reports, look at all the vulnerabilities, take it to the business with tech risk, business risk, all of that, roll out the 5x5 risk matrix, etc. But the interesting what thing was when getting to these meetings was, as you would, understand this, a lot more than me was, tech risk come at it from one angle and then business risk come at it from a completely different angle. So when you're looking at vulnerabilities, it's like, okay, tech risk, what do you rate it versus, I mean, this is going back a decade, right? What do you would rate this? And then, business risk. Very rarely was there alignment at all. And then it became quite contentious. There was sort of arguments that started to happen because people didn't agree, or why would you think that's, that severe, etc. So what would be your thoughts on getting some alignment from, people at the end of the day trying to protect the business, but coming at it from very different perspectives?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you a real story about how to do that. I think that's kind of better than me maybe just, philosophizing. So one of the various CISO gigs, this is a cloud native company. They had just gone public and they needed a global CISO global experience with public experience, particularly software experience. And, when I showed up, one of the questions based on the nature of the business, one of the questions I asked is, well, how much regulated data, and this is a cloud native company, so in the cloud, how much regulated data are they persisting? So in this case, first of all, I went to the chief privacy officer, who was a peer. I said, hey, given the nature of this business and the type of data we're persisting, this is, by the way, this is largely SMS data for phone calls, whatnot. And I said, hey, is the data that we're actually retaining for billing purposes, is that personally identifiable information? So PII from the US designation, but globally, is it regulated? She said, absolutely. I said, okay, great. So she had identified, she owned that designation. I then went to the CTO org, went to the data management folks. I said, hey, how much, you can give me a range if you like, how much of this data are we persisting? They said, we can tell you, give or take a few billion, it's 2 trillion records. I was like, oh my, okay, wow. Now I'm starting to get the McBurks. I then went to the GC and I said, hey, I want to review our cyber insurance policy. I reviewed the policy. We had a limit of roughly 20 million. So, and by the way, this is a company that only had 250 million in revenue. So at that point, I had some data and I was kind of feeling a little nervous. So I went to the CFO and GC and said, hey, did you know we were persisting 2 trillion records? And they've been here for 5 years. They said, actually, no, we didn't know that. Note to self, you probably should, but okay, that's fine. So I then said, well, 250 million revenue, 2 trillion, I'm like, I'm a little nervous here. I think our limit's a little light. Do you agree? And they said, yes. And I said, okay, well, let's meet with our brokers. Hey, brokers, why did you give us 20 million in limit? I said, well, we did a benchmark, and given the firmographics and the revenue, 20 million was kind of the central value, mean value. You guys said, okay. I said, but did anyone tell you we would persist 2 trillion records of PII? And they said no, and they got really excited. And we ended up immediately binding more insurance, and I used that to build out my whole budget. But the point here is that I'm starting out by already engaging my stakeholders, and I'm getting them involved in the process. And indeed, they're owning, in many cases, the assessment, right? When I come to them with just vague, vulnerability counts and things that have absolutely no meaning to the business, there's, no wonder we'll get, contentious results. So I want to start with where is the value at risk? And then when I can get agreement with my stakeholders across the aisle with technology, in this case, legal and finance, then I can go about starting a budget, and then we can have some context, right? So when we start seeing, misconfiguration, right? When we see, a lack of control, particularly related around this data, we have vulnerabilities. Now we have context to go about talking about how we go about prioritizing remediation and whatnot. But I just want to say that the most important thing is how you actually work with your stakeholders, get them involved in the process early. What doesn't work is dumping a laundry list of vulnerabilities in someone's backlog without any business context whatsoever. I think that's failure. Hopefully that made sense.
Well, it does, because I mean, when you're running, like, depending on the size of the company, when you're running thousands and thousands of risks that haven't been looked at in gosh knows how long years, it's hard. And then it's like, okay, like to your vernacular before, a laundry list of things you're just going to keep adding on there. Like I've just seen that people started to get checked out, not really involved as much.
Vulnerability is not a risk, by the way. For a large, I was pretty GE globally. I'm in a Twilio lending club. I ran street operations across the United States for the largest health maintenance organization in that country. And a vulnerability is just not a risk. It doesn't start becoming a risk until it's associated with some plausible loss associated with your value at risk. Again, what the business stands to lose. Just want to be clear. One of the reasons that security operations has such a difficult time is because they're looking at tactical things that are disconnected from value. And then going to people, going to engineers, going to your CTO, whatever, and say, hey, here, you can thank me later. Here's 100,000 vulnerabilities. Go fix them. But their job is to go generate value for the business, to release products, make sure the platform is resilient. And you're coming with what, without any context, without tied to the business, is just a distraction. It's no wonder why we don't see the sorts of actions that we would expect. So I just want to make clear, a vulnerability is not a risk.
Yeah, so this is the part that gets interesting, right? So I've worked in these teams before. It's like, hundreds of thousands of all these things, but, some of these things, like, it's okay. We don't need to really worry about it. But depends on who you're talking to. And you mentioned before an engineer, I know how they think. They're gonna be like, oh, we have to eliminate all these things, which some of these things are just not practical. So it's going to make sense. We don't need to do it. And like, obviously you need to prioritize all of these risks, etc. But to your point, the context. Do you think that's the part that perhaps people are not connecting the dots on? Because if I had to say, "Hey, Richard, here's 100,000 different things," you're gonna be like, "Well, where do we start? What's the context?" Would you say that's probably the gap in the market at the moment?
Well, I'm biased, right? I'm kind of wrote the book on, well, co-authored the book on this stuff. I actually think the biggest patch for security is really our concept of risk. I'd say our concept of measurement and risk. I think it's I think it's the fundamental problem that we have. We're investing in a lot of solutions that are generating a lot of telemetry, but we are not contextualizing that in a way that makes, again, sense to the business, right? So again, do you have vulnerabilities that are associated with, again, with something that's persisting regulated data, or with with a system that, if it were to be disrupted for even an hour, it could have millions of dollars of impact, right? Do those vulnerabilities have anything to do with, again, data exfiltration or business disruption? Are they exposed? Are there threats that are correlated? Do you have inline controls or, host-based controls that mitigate that? Are you taking all that context into consideration? If you don't have the operational context and the business context, you're just going to be claiming bad things, fix them. I just think it's going to be really hard to compete with, value creation. You're like, well, I mean, your CFO, for example, I'm going to tell you, most CFOs, the money they give to security is out of a vague sense of moral obligation. I'll say it again. Most CFOs, when they're signing off on a budget for security, I'd say even CEOs, typically, I mean, they'll sing a good song, right? They'll say, "Oh, security is the most important thing." Typically, though, they don't understand it. It's not their fault. It's our fault because we are not bringing in the business context. We're not showing operationally how vulnerabilities, how threats, how it relates to some plausibly material loss for the business, right? And actually, I'd argue with you, like, you look at the SEC, Security Exchange Commission. If you look at even what's emerging in DORA, even regulations here, I think this is what the regulators are saying. Look, do you have a cybersecurity risk management program for critical infrastructure? Do you have a program that's focused on those sorts of losses that would be material? That means you have to understand the infrastructure. You have to understand the business so that you can then correlate, again, threats and vulnerabilities to that business, and then be able to prioritize and take actions. Because back to your point, you don't have this checkbook where you can just write endless, endless checks and whatnot to all these vendors and whatnot. You have to pick and choose and have to focus on those things that matter. So I'm kind of going along here. Hopefully some of that makes sense.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that you said which was interesting. So contextualizing, I agree. I was a reporting analyst before, and that was my whole job, basically looking at facts and figures, telemetry, and saying like, why should people care about this, right? But then you said, people don't have a concept of measurement and risk. So what do you mean by that? Talk to me a little bit more about that.
So the concept of measurement. So when you're measuring something, you're trying to measure risk, right? You're taking in telemetry. Oftentimes we, in security in particular, will confuse telemetry with actual measurement. So there's like kind of two things that we need to do in security that I consider to be table stakes. This is beyond just the telemetry. So for example, from an asset perspective, when I say asset, I'm being very open-ended, like a business unit can be an asset. In fact, a whole business could be an asset. Or you could be talking about a server, but typically I'm talking at something a little larger, at least a crown jewel, if not a business unit. So I need to understand value and exposure. Is A, does it have some sort of business value, and is it exposed? So telemetry, I could bring in telemetry, I measure it to determine is there value and exposure. That's on the asset. And then on the threat side, I need to understand intent and capability. Telemetry in to understand intent and capability. So if I understand intent, capability, right, value and exposure, for a security professional, that's now table stake, right? Now I know whether or not I have something at risk. And now my job is to measure whether or not I'm eliminating risk in a capitally and operationally efficient manner. So it's from telemetry right, to measurement, right, in terms of again, value and exposure from an asset perspective, then intent and capability. And from an asset exposure, I mean, I'm talking about understanding your vulnerabilities, state of identity, right? Again, business values of persisting regulated data. What does it mean in terms of business disruption, blah, blah, blah. And bringing those things together, now I'm in a place to start investing in controls and then measuring whether or not I'm capitally and operationally efficient in reducing that risk, buying it down and or transferring it away. That is the business of security. That right there, right? And so it is a measurement game. It is a data game. It's a business game. Listen, the language of business is counting things up. The business of science is counting things up. And the business of security is counting things up as well. There's no difference.
So I want to know why historically cybersecurity people or risk managers or anyone in that space, why haven't we as an industry done a good job at contextualizing like what this means for people in a way that makes sense? And I know it's like a broader conversation, but I'm curious to hear from your perspective with your experience.
Well, I think it's still a nascent field. It's still relatively nascent, right? But the first CISO emerged maybe 25 years ago, maybe. Now you're starting to see college degrees and whatnot. You're getting undergraduate and graduate degrees in cybersecurity, which is a whole nother conversation. But I think it's a function of it being early, not a lot of principled scholarship involved yet. I think that's starting to change. So the practice of what cybersecurity is, there's just not a lot of grounded principles. So when I say principles, for example, if someone's, I guess I will talk about schooling. Like I feel sorry for people who are going and getting their undergraduate or graduate degree in cybersecurity. I mean, the skills you learn are immediately potentially irrelevant because it's such a dynamic environment. Where if you're studying a true engineering or STEM discipline, you have a lot of principled practices, be it from mathematics and otherwise, that will apply for the whole of your career. And by the way, when I say security, I'm putting encryption aside, like that whole field. That's definitely very established. It's a little different. But I just think so you have people who, they were maybe they're IT folks. This is going back years, or maybe they were network engineers. And then, someone looked at them and said, oh, you have a beard and some tattoos and you have some metal in your face. Hey, you're probably a security person. Good. Now you're the stuckee. But you don't have a disciplined set of practices that, for managing this kind of risk. And I think that has a lot to do with it. It's a new field where we haven't established what the curriculum is, not principled. And I think, maybe it's a function of newness, or maybe it's again, a function of, maybe it's a function of lack of education, but that creates a real insular sort of discipline. When I say insular, you'll hear this from security folks. Oh, there's nothing else like security. Like, we have chaotic actors and dynamic systems and no one else has that. I'm like, what on earth are you about? I mean, this body is a dynamic adversarial system. And just, from a biological perspective, look at warfare. I mean, we need to look outside of ourselves to other people who are confronting some amount of irreducible uncertainty where the stakes are high. And even if you don't have all the information, you still need to make a bet. And there's just innumerate fields out there that we need to be looking at. And we need to be adopting their practices as appropriate and bringing them into security. By the way, that's innovation. And we just haven't done that. And security in many ways is, I don't know, it's like this, we're like a tribe in the Amazon that's somehow avoided the gaze of modernity for a couple decades now. That has to change. Stakes are too high, right? And so again, I just think we need to really up level the practices and really adopt the practice of measurement from, natural sciences. There's just so many interesting fields. Evolutionary biology, like there's just, again, where you have small, messy data. We like to think our problem's a big data problem. I actually think it's a small data problem. We need to humble ourselves and start reading broadly, educating ourselves, and bringing more business, analytical discipline to our field and to our management practices.
So do you think that, over time is going to get better? Because some of the stuff that you're saying, when I was doing, the reporting function was like, I don't know, 10 years ago and change. These problems that you're raising now, they were problems back then. So I'm like, well, I guess the needle conceptually is changing and it's getting better, but it hasn't got that much better. And this is a decade on now. So like, is this going to accelerate from your hypothesis, or do you think it's still going to take a fair bit of time to get to that euphoric sort of state?
Well, I don't know if it's a euphoric state. I think the work is still hard. I think it might get better. So, good news, right? So the book I co-authored, it's graduate school curriculum at Harvard, Brown, Berkeley, MIT, blah, blah, blah. It's the main curriculum for the Department of Defense CISO program here in the United States. It's the only security book that's been required reading by the Society of Actuaries exam. So tens of thousands of people have purchased it. So I'd like to think that other people like you, not just you and me, but thousands and thousands of other professionals they're seeing that there's a problem. There needs to be a change, right? And in fact, I'm here in Australia. I'm on a tour. I'm doing 2 workshops a day plus things like this. And I'm having CISOs from your largest companies showing up to get trained. So those folks are seeing it. So I like to think that other folks are going to be, I like to think 10 years from now, we're going to see better measurement practices. We're going to see, a whole cadre of professionals who, in terms of the art and science of cybersecurity risk management, are fully trained, quantitatively savvy, and, business savvy and taken seriously. Again, I know there's a lot of language. Well, we take security really seriously. Well, what I mean is where, the CFO and the CISO and the GC, Chief Risk Officer, they're all speaking the language of risk, and, quantitatively and qualitatively. And I'd like to think we're going to see that change. I'm trying to make that change, and I think it's happening. It's just a little slow. I'll admit.
So, what I meant before by euphoric state is more a better state than currently what's happening. So, how would you sort of measure then? I mean, like, okay, just say in a year's time you come back on the show and I'm like, so hey, Richard, have things improved since the last time we chatted? How would you sort of measure that? Like, was there any sort of markers or indicators that would sort of say, hey, like we're definitely moving in the right direction?
Well, that's a great question. It's the question I would ask. And let me ask this to both of us. What would I see occurring empirically, mathematically, unambiguously, that would let me know that the culture of security is improving from a measurement perspective, right? Quantitatively. I'm saying that in part that's a problem. Well, I would see from a board perspective that it would be accepted and expected practice to talk about impact as dollars exclusively. Impact is dollars. By the way, that's how business runs. That's how, you don't go to CFO and go to CFO, hey, what kind of budget you want? I'd like a high budget, please. Or how about your paycheck? I'd like that to be medium high, red. No, that's not the language of business. So we would be speaking the language of business. Impact would be exclusively understood monetarily. And when we say the word likelihood, that would be a true likelihood. It would be a probability. It wouldn't be some term like likely, high, medium, or low. So again, we'd be using the language. So, by the way, people say, well, you can't do that. Security is too uncertain. See, again, this goes to the confusion of measurement. We measure when we are uncertain and the stakes are high. We measure when we don't have all the information, but we need to make a bet. By the way, that's called science. That's how we measure. That's how we do things. We hold to accuracy over precision when we still need to make a bet and we have a lot of uncertainty. And in fact, we might have so much uncertainty and we may be lacking in telemetry, we need to rely wholly on our expertise. We don't just throw our hands up and say, I give up fighting. No. So I would expect in a year's time, if I start seeing more and more boards that would reject wholly, like the heat map, they would reject it, And by the way, I think that might be happening. If you look at the National Association of Corporate Directors, their 2023 Cyber Handbook. So NACD is if you're a board member in the United States, you're part of the NACD, you're reading their materials. So their handbook, the last one, 2023, it was an ode to cybersecurity risk management. Quantitative. My book was one of the main references for that. In fact, I was shipped out then to the UK. I did a keynote at Lloyd's of London. This is with the IOD. The IOD is the sister organization, the NACD, to talk about quantification. I would love to see board members that they would just hands down reject the heat map. Get it out of here. It's business risk. We're talking about protecting the business. We're going to talk about impact in dollars, and why wouldn't we? We're going to talk about likelihood as a probability. That's what I'd want to see. There you go. We're not going to see that in a year, but I think we'll start seeing that more and more. We have to. I don't know how we can continue making it up.
Okay, you said something that's really interesting, and I've spoken about, and I've asked people like yourself on the show before, so maybe you can shed a bit more light on this. So you said impact as dollars. So I want to give you an example, and then talk me through your thinking. So in recent times, let's go with there was a healthcare provider that got breached, for example. The part that was interesting is yes, that happened in that time, and they lost people. But the part that was really interesting to me was what about the long tail impacts of how to get that trust back because this company got breached? Like, is it going to take 20 years to potentially build back the customer base? How do you measure that? Like, I know you probably need some, really smart, like actuarialist or someone to sort of measure that. But do you have any insight then on that? Because it's something that over my experience of running this show of almost 300 episodes, I've asked people that question. They're like, look, it's really hard, KB. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that around the long tail impact of, a breach or anything like that?
I have a lot of thoughts. So prior to this current gig, I was a chief risk officer for the leading mid-market cyber insurance company. So building models and whatnot, right? So they insured companies between 100 million and 10 billion in revenue. Upside limit was we wrote 20 million. So have a bit of background. But your question is, you're really talking about like brand impact, right? The trust, but brand impact. But the question you need to ask yourselves is what is causal to brand impact? And more importantly, what would I see occurring mathematically, unambiguously, empirically, that would let me know that we've experienced brand impact? So for example, like you think of the Caesars and MGM breach, by the way, Caesars paid right away and didn't experience the same sorts of losses that MGM had. But people said, yeah, but the big losses were brand, because did you see what happened in the stock market? Yes, and it was not outside of normal variance at that time, and they recovered fully from their stock. And by the way, people are still showing up and pulling on the one-armed bandit at both those places. No, there is no perceptive brand impact. Well, it probably was for MGM. They were down 14 days or 10 days. They lost 100 million deterministically, right, due to business disruption. But the question is, again, when we say, so we use intangible terms. Listen, intangibles make the world go around. Love, hate, trust. And again, when someone says brand impact, you want to ask, okay, first of all, what would I see occurring empirically, mathematically, and ambiguously that would let me know we had brand impact? And if someone can't articulate that, then you might have what we call in decision science a useless decomposition.
Right, but that's the part that when I'm asking people, I feel like people just can't, and maybe you've articulated it probably the best, but I've asked people all over the world, and it's hard for them to maybe explain that. And the part that I'm even more interested in, okay, go back to your Caesars example. So it's like, okay, are they still going to have the residual impact in terms of dollars 5, 10 years later? Like, or when does that sort of impact on, oh, that event happened, I'm not using those guys again? When does that sort of stop, or how does that impact start to be, not, it doesn't become an impact over, over the years, for example?
Well, you're presupposing that that's occurring. I'm saying in that case, it didn't. It can happen. It didn't in that case. But by the way, in cyber insurance or any sort of insurance, claims do have a long tail. Class action lawsuits and other sorts of legal things can go on for years, years, and years, and years. Those costs may have nothing to do with what you might call brand impact. That you can have you can have long tails on these things. So I want to make a distinction here. Again, your focus is on some sort of, you call it customer, lack of trust. Let's talk about that. You're saying that there's a reduction in sale, right? There's a reduction in the value of the stock or something. And the question then is, okay, if that's happened, let's presuppose that, and by the way, there's no confounding factors. We've determined that the causal factor was because there was a business disruption, there was a data breach, or there was some other, whatever the phenomenon was, there was some losses. And again, we can deterministically show that a portion of the long-term tail of losses is directly attributed to customers going to another brand, right? So we've decided that. So your question actually is, can we forecast if and when that would change? Sure, that's just doing business. And business is in the business of forecasting sales and other things. And I would just go, all right, well, how do we go? That's what business does. I'm in a business that, by the way, is publicly traded. We're making forecasts about sales all the time. You have to be good and relatively, conservative. So you're back to just doing business. All right, we've lost market share, for some reason, and how recapture more TAM. What do we need to do? And so you're back to forecast. But you are making a forecast again, about some plausible future, state of business, there is some amount of uncertainty. And so, but you still have to make, you're still going to make forecasts. So that's my point. But again, I really want to untangle this idea of brand impact. People say it all the time. That's the biggest thing they're concerned with. And we have, again, this is going back to just principled security. You have to ask people, what the heck are you talking about? Right? Again, a problem well defined is a problem half solved. That's Kettering. We have to say, what would I see occurring specifically, mathematically and ambiguously, that would let me know that we had brand impact? Okay, great. Once we know that, then we can start talking about what's causal to that. And once we understand what's causal to that, then we can start talking about what we need to do then to mitigate that or remediate that and move on. I don't think this language that I'm using is taught enough to security folks. And it's day one sort of thinking that should be in school, in undergraduate, grad school curriculum. I really think this is where we as professionals need to be heading.
Well, you're right, and I think that this is the gap. So, like as I mentioned before, like when I was reporting analysts, like the stuff you're talking about, we weren't doing this type of stuff. So you make a great point, like sales forecasts. Absolutely, people do that. I haven't seen people doing enough of what you're talking about at all. And in a way that contextualizes, well, what does this mean? And if we get, like I worked in a bank, the data breach, what does that mean? Was it attributed to, well, now like 50,000 people cut their mortgage loan because they don't trust us anymore, whatever the reasoning is due to this forecast that we have. I haven't seen enough of that.
Yeah. So your question, you correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, but the question is, all right, we can attribute the customer attrition to this breach. We've done our work. We know that happened, and it was customer churn that was significantly outside of normal variance, and it started right there with that bad thing. And the question then is, okay, what do we need to do to get those customers back? And I'd call that's doing business. I mean, that is not just the CISO. That's really the CEO and others. You call it getting back trust. Well, you're going to have to start making some bets about how, maybe it's, again, I want to stay in my swim lane, but it's making offers that would, I don't know if it's cutting costs, and making it, I don't know what it might be, but there's going to have to be something they're going to do to get business back. That's just the cost of doing business. We don't see, again, it happens, but we don't, Equifax would be an example, but by and large, like Target, actually in the first edition of our book, and I think it's in the second edition as well, we talk about the Target breach. People are saying, brand impact. So if you look at their stock price during that time, there was the dip, but that, again, it was not outside of normal variance from a time series perspective, right? It was totally within variance. So meaning you couldn't, in a grounded manner, attribute any churn to the breach. In fact, really no customer trust broken. There's nothing there. It happens, but I think it's rarer than people think.
And that's going back to the Target breach, I think it was 2013 or something like that. So more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm curious about is do you think now starting to be like, well, Richard, I'm not shopping at Target because they got breached like a decade plus ago. Like that's the part, are people still saying that? And you made a great point. It dipped in the stock, and we've seen that happen over, the recent breaches happened in Australia, even recently, but then it recovers.
I don't think anybody said that. I don't think anybody did that. I don't think it had an impact at all on customer sentiment. There's no empirical, mathematically unambiguous evidence that ever occurred at all. I don't think they gave a shite. I'm saying it can happen, but so my advocacy here is really, again, I love this quote. I'll just keep using it, beat a dead horse. It's a problem well defined is a problem half solved. Let's be really super clear about what we're talking about and super clear about what the evidence is of that thing, right? And we have to decompose our intangibles to tangibles, right? So that's key for risk management. Well, security is full of a lot of drama, and we need to, I'm like the anti-drama guy. Let's get down to let's engineer this and talk. What are we really talking about? Where's the accountable stuff?
Well, absolutely, and that going to your point around the drama, that's right. And this is the part that I'm trying to have this discussion, which is important because even some of the breaches here in Australia, I'm still a customer of these companies.
Right.
So did it annoy me? Yes, it did annoy me, but it's like, oh well, I've been using these people for a while, so it just makes sense to stay, right? But going back to the Target example, I don't think anyone's sort of saying online or anywhere oh well, I'm not going there anymore because of the breach that was ages ago. So I'm feeling even more so now and maybe you would understand more about this than me, it's getting to the point where I feel like people are becoming super desensitized. It's like, oh, well, another breach. Like, who cares? I've even heard people saying on forums and social media that I look through is, oh, well, my information's already out there anyway. So, what do you think's going to happen?
Well, I've got an example that we could think of that, let's see what happens. Time will tell, but CrowdStrike, what about them? They've been hammered in stock market, right? I'm curious to see I want to keep observing it, right? But I think there's an example. My suspicion is that they're going to have a long tail impact from this breach, right? I mean, look at, that's kind of an epiphany of the obvious, I suppose. What about LastPass? What about them? I mean, by the way, I haven't gone and done the analysis in terms of how much customer churn they've had, right? But I think there are examples there, and we should look at that. And I think that's potentially interesting as well. And that goes to your use case. Okay, let's presuppose that there's going to be a case of CrowdStrike, billions of dollars of impact. How long is that tail? And to your point again, what do they need to do to win back the market's trust? Again, we need to observe that. We need to see this play out a little bit more. But there are, again, I don't want to say that what you're saying is not valid. I think it is valid, but we just need to be super clear about when it's actually occurring and how long of a tail it is and how much it matters. And we might find that the CrowdStrike thing 6 months from now, they're back on top again. I have a feeling that one's it was so far reaching. We'll see what happens. I think there'll probably be some regulatory impact from that and legislation and whatnot. Who knows? I don't know. We'll keep observing.
Well, I was going to ask, how long do you think that long tail is going to last for?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball on that.
But if you had to guess, though, with your background, like, what do you think? Do you think it could be years, or do you think, like, 12 months? Like, I know it's not like fact. It's just more so giving an indicator with all the work you're doing.
So from a claims experience at my previous place, one of the things, after I just started, one of the things that was happening is we were seeing claims for business disruption caused by outages of SaaS third party. In fact, we were seeing like an exponential increase in claims that was surprising to the underwriters. They're like, oh my gosh, we didn't account for that. Our models, obviously they changed that. By the way, my previous resilience, loss ratios are the lowest in the industry. They're great at this. But it was early on, that was kind of surprising. So the question I have for folks who are doing third-party risk management, big, huge topic I get asked about all the time. When you start looking at the third parties that you are using, I think it is your job to start thinking about, okay, when you're thinking about taking on a new third party, one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, okay, could we become dependent on this customer, or excuse me, this third party, where it could cause, if it stops operating, it could cause business disruption for us. I mean, these are some of the things that we need to start thinking about. And we do need to start measuring and looking at, okay, what might that impact be? Again, we have to do that in such a way that's appropriately conservative, thoughtful, and not irrational, right? Because the reality is your business, again, is in the business of business. They're going to want to adopt a lot of third parties, like the whole AI thing, seeing that as well. People are going to look, we're going to digitally AI transform. We're going to adopt these services. But you as a risk management professional, your job is to start understanding, okay, cumulatively, are we getting ourselves in a situation where we could, have business disruption? And oftentimes the question then is, all right, if there's not anything we can do to truly mitigate those losses, then we're starting to talk about risk transfer. Are we in a situation where we are going to significantly, and I think more and more CISOs need to think about this from a third-party risk management perspective, and are we getting to a situation where I need to increase my limits? Or are we in a situation where my capital, going beyond my limits, my capital reserves, right? Am I in a position, a cash position and a mitigation position, where given our expansive use of third parties, I get what parties, not a third party, but am I in a position where I've helped my business be resilient to plausible future loss, where I might have a third-party outage, or something similar to CrowdStrike, where maybe have all these agents deployed, something bad's happened, who knows what. But am I in a position where if I had even concurrent losses like this from both my risk transfer and even my capital reserves, am I in a place where I can hopefully be resilient and continue to meet my obligations to my stakeholders and my shareholders and my customers? So I think, I'm just kind of flipping the conversation. This is the type of thinking that I think we, as the defenders and as increasingly the modern cybersecurity risk management experts, we need to be thinking about. And by the way, I'll just say this fortunate position where I'm regularly, this week alone, I've been in front of a good 50 or so CISOs, do this all the time. And I'm asking this question, how many of you are now involved in cyber insurance? Not just doing those nasty spreadsheets you get from brokers that are coming through from the underwriters, but where you are actually the one who's defining the limits, right? Where you're the one who's going to go out and get the contract, meaning giving your residual risk, given if you've spent on controls, where you're the one who's expected to go and determine what type of limits you need to protect the business, right? But I just think that's where, when it comes to understanding, what does CrowdStrike mean, or whatever third party, I think where the rubber meets the road is where we as defenders need to start looking at our third party risks and starting to understand that listen, there's just stuff that we're going to have to do because of the cost of doing business. I mean, you're going to need EDR. You're going to listen, you need inline and host-based protections. You just have to do it, regulatory perspective, but just from a business perspective. And so then we need to start understanding, okay, while it might be quote, quote, black swan, don't really like that term, but really low likelihood with potentially high impact. All right, assuming that could happen, have I put myself in a position from a resilience perspective, and I'm using resilience in the bigger term here, business terms, from both, again, a transfer and both risk transfer to your insurance, but risk transfer to your capital reserves. Am I in a position to continue to deliver business value to my stakeholders, to my shareholders? And this is where I want to see CISOs going. I'm seeing some indication of that.
Richard, really appreciate your time. Just quickly, do you have any closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I think I might love Australia. I've really enjoyed the small amount of time I've had here. I'm in Melbourne. I'm about to I'm going to Sydney and Brisbane. I'll just share with you that the appetite for learning, your security leaders are coming out for this content, and they're really coming out. They're really engaged. I think actually and I've done this a lot in the UK, I think they might be second to you guys in terms of really wanting to engage in deep intellectual conversations about risk. Yes, my country's coming out as well, but I don't know. There's something in the water here with the Aussies. You guys are engaged. So I'm really hopeful based on what I'm seeing here. I'd say keep up the good work. I've loved the conversations I've had, and I'm just so glad to be here and thankful that I've had the chance to talk to you.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by MercSec, your smarter route to security talent. MercSec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.